So welcome to today's Casco Bay Coastal Academy. The topic today is on long-term planning, conservation tools and strategies that support resilient coastal habitats. We are hosting a similar session on May 8th that will be more focused on inland communities. So if you're a service provider, you may want to sign up for that one as well. So we are recording today's webinar. A lot of familiar faces here, but if you're new to Casco Bay Coastal Academy, it's a mostly quarterly workshop aimed at building the knowledge base of municipal board members and staff about critical coastal issues and providing the skills and training to support project planning and implementation. Today's webinar, we always have a lot of partners, and today we have 3 partners who've organized the webinar. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Victoria Boundy. I work for Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. We're part of a national estuary program based at the University of Southern Maine, and we collaborate and work with many, many different organizational partners to protect and restore Casco Bay. I have 2 other organizers here with me, and I'll invite Gabe to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Gabe McPhail. I'm the Region 1 coordinator for the Community Resilience Partnership.
Thanks, Gabe. And Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Brunicini. I'm a coastal resilience specialist with Maine Sea Grant and the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership.
Great. Thanks, Gabe and Jessica. Just a few Zoom reminders, if I can advance this. It's not letting me advance. There we go. Whoops. It's going too fast here. I know we're all very familiar with these Zoom meetings by now, but I did want to invite you to put your name and any affiliations next to your lovely profile picture, and also remind you to mute yourself. But also, when questions come up during the presentations, you can add those to the chat. During the first presentation, you can also raise your hand and ask questions during that presentation, and we'll have time at the end to ask more questions. Briefly go over the agenda here. Is everyone seeing that? Okay. Very quick session here, and we are fortunate to have a couple of great presenters. We have first up Corinne Michaud-LeBlanc. She's the climate coordinator for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, beginning with Habitat program. She will provide an overview of conservation planning tools and strategies for a changing climate and how to use them. Second speaker is Pete Slovinsky, marine geologist with Maine Geological Survey, and he's going to focus in a little bit on how climate change is impacting vulnerable dune habitat in coastal communities. Again, Corinne invites you to raise your hand and ask questions during the presentation if you have a burning question. So without further ado, let me stop sharing and let Corinne go ahead and get started. So introduce Corinne from Beginning with Habitat.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Victoria. Everybody seeing my slides okay? All right, so really excited to be here today to talk to a whole group of people interested in coastal habitat conservation for climate resilience. And as Victoria said, my name is Corinne Michaud-LeBlanc. I'm the climate coordinator within the Beginning with Habitat program. And just a couple quick housekeeping things. I have kind of built in a couple pauses where people can drop questions in the chat anytime or raise hands when I give a pause. There should be plenty of time for questions, and we'll be mindful of giving Pete enough time after this first session. And I can also make these slides available, or I'm happy to connect with anybody afterwards that has questions that don't get answered. So I'll start with a little bit of an overview of the agency I work for and the Beginning with Habitat Partnership. I'm housed at the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and at our agency, we're charged with conserving all the species that call inland Maine home and the habitats that support them, as well as supporting public recreational access to the outdoors. And at the Beginning with Habitat program, we're a partnership of state agencies, federal agencies, and nonprofit partners that collaborate to collect and share natural resource data and facilitate conservation planning at various scales across the state to ensure that Maine's plants, wildlife, and habitats can endure for generations to come. Increasingly important in the face of climate change, as we'll talk about. So I thought it would be helpful kind of at the top here to go over a little bit of an overview of how these tools and strategies fit into a broader planning framework, realizing that not every process is going to be perfectly linear. These are some of the kind of broad phases. So a community sort of opts in or recognizes some sort of a need for, climate planning or comprehensive planning. And there may already be a committee in town that's charged with dealing with that planning need, or a committee may be formed. And I would say today we're kind of at the information gathering stage. So folks in the audience are likely already taking part in one of these processes or interested in starting one. And so there's an information gathering stage. I'll be doing a little bit of a tool talk today, talking about specific kinds of data and tools that can be used for these planning purposes. And you also in this stage might be talking to different experts, having presentations, looking at sample plans. There's really important next step in this process would be robust community input. So after kind of figuring out the scope of the planning effort and the data needs, you want to go through a public process of prioritizing what the public thinks are needs and some visioning surveys. This can take a lot of different forms. And then after likely a lot of drafting, and this is probably kind of circular, more public input, a completed plan gets reviewed and accepted by the appropriate entities, whether that's the community or a state agency. And I wanted to highlight a couple important features of an effective plan would be to have very specific actions with the specific timeline and responsible parties, so that you can actually make use of all this work that went into the plan and make some things happen on the ground. And that would be the implementation and funding stage. So I also just wanted to highlight here the areas that I've starred are steps in this process that beginning with habitat can help with, whether that's providing the data or sample ordinances and plans, presentations on any kind of topics of interest, as well as review of draft chapters and help with revising ordinances or crafting new ordinances and things like that the town might be interested in or have identified as actions. We don't administer any specific funding sources, but we also try and share out opportunities such as the Community Resilience Partnership funding opportunities and Maine DOT funding opportunities that synchronize with the strategies that we promote, like addressing undersized culverts and open space planning and things like that. So if folks are familiar with the Community Resilience Partnership, most every strategy under Section E would really sync up with a lot of our tools and technical assistance that we can provide. So I'll go through a little bit of an overview of our partnership for folks who might not be too familiar or up to date. Regenerative Habitat is a landscape-based approach to achieving meaningful conservation of all native species on a developing landscape. And we have a variety of in-person and online and print services. So we serve up digital data packages, print maps. We do a lot of in-person presentations or virtual workshops like this. And we have a variety of expertise on our team, from mapping to private landowners to landscape connectivity. And so one thing I want to emphasize is if nothing else, I hope that folks have a familiar face now that they can reach out to after today and realize that if I can't personally help with your question, we have a whole team of folks that we can connect you with and help with your climate planning, conservation planning needs. And we typically work with municipalities, landowners, and land trusts, but we're available to work at kind of any scale across the state. So regional efforts all the way down to private landowners. These are our sort of core series of maps, map 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to build a story using map 1 and 2 and how those can work into your conservation planning and community resilience planning. And if you are interested in joining our next webinar, I'll talk a little bit more about map 3 at that in a couple weeks. So in addition to those print maps that we share out, we have all of that same data available on our website. We have an interactive map viewer that I'll show some examples of, and the Maine stream habitat viewer is a nice companion to planning for infrastructure resilience, flooding resilience, and aquatic connectivity. So I'll talk about some examples from that. And we also have custom digital data and all of our print maps available online as PDF. So that wraps up the overview of the program. And we're going to try and jump into a little bit of audience participation. I see that there's a lot of things going on in the chat, but right now I thought I'd pause for a moment and see if folks want to pop into the chat any observed or expected effects of climate change that you're seeing, whether it's kind of in your own community or in the state as a whole. Let's take this opportunity for a quick screen. Great, so I see lots of great ideas coming into the chat. Most of these I'll be touching on today. So, and keep those coming because I love to see, learn new things about what people are seeing and keep in tune with that. So I'll just throw up some of these items here that sync with a lot of things that folks are talking about. So warming temperatures I saw, and flooding. Some pictures here on the bottom of situations that we're seeing in Maine. So whether it's inland extreme precipitation causing washing out of roads and flooding along streams and waterways, coastal erosion, flooding, storm surge. These are pictures from Maine DOT. And then on the topic of warming temperatures and warming winters, we're seeing things like ice pack breaking up sooner than usual, or maybe not icing in. And these affect our communities in various ways, from safety, using our roads, costing a lot of money to fix these things, as well as damaging the habitats that a lot of our species live in, or creating barriers for species that need to move along these waterways. So now I'm going to kind of move from that story of all these kind of dramatic things that we're seeing and how our tools can help to learn about your landscape and come up with actions to increase resilience in your community. So starting with our map 1, this is our water resources and riparian habitats map. Depicts features like great ponds, wetlands, streams, as well as mandatory riparian buffers and priority wild brook trout areas. I'm going to use Pittsburgh as a kind of community of interest throughout the talk, but again, these resources are available for any town. And to show you how that looks on our online habitat viewer and give folks an idea of how you can use that more custom approach, this is a zoomed in screenshot of Pittsburgh, so you can locate any town in Maine using the search bar. And you can toggle on all the same features that are on our print map. So here I've selected kind of the suite of layers that go into our water resources map. And our legend has a lot of great details about all of those data layers, as well as recommended habitat management measures. And you can click on any feature on the map to pull up direct links to more information. So that's sort of the data and the tools. But what we also want to think about is strategies that can, sorry, I'm trying to look at my notes here. Actually, I guess that's all I wanted to say on that part. So I'm going to move to another tool that's kind of a companion to the water resources map, and that's the Maine Stream Habitat Viewer. I was trying not to monitor chat questions, but I just saw Pete pop up and I'll answer that on the fly. Map significant vernal pools are included and begin with habitat layers. That's on our map 2, and I should be able to point out an example of that. So anything, yes, that's been mapped and designated as a significant vernal pool is included in our wildlife habitats layer under significant wildlife habitat. So with the Maine Stream Habitat Viewer, this is getting at more resilience planning for those undersized culverts or barriers to aquatic connectivity that are becoming especially problematic with sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme precipitation events. These these crossings are a great target for addressing resilience in the community by planning to upgrade them using designs that are going to pass more water flow. So that's going to really help the riparian corridors and the species that use the waterways and the riparian habitat, as well as infrastructure resilience and safety of the community. So this tool uses a red, orange, green color system, and red would be a current barrier, orange is a potential barrier, and green is not posing a barrier. And there's specific locations and pictures of every mapped crossing. And another thing I want to point out, this tool is great for land trusts and municipalities that are planning ahead for infrastructure projects on lands that they manage. And also a great tool when you're seeking funding for those projects, because it has a lot of data that you're going to need to design those projects and identify where the priorities are in town.
And Corinne, do you see there's a question from Devin in the chat? Does this data overlap with the tidal restriction atlas?
It's not exactly the same, but the tool, and thank you for that question, because I wanted to also, I don't have screenshots of that tool, but it is very similar. Most crossings will appear in both, but not all. The tidal restriction atlas is a really similar tool that covers the coastal zone for similar planning purposes. It's going to show you current barriers as well as potential future barriers based on as sea level rise occurs and as the hydrology is changing. And so you would probably want to consult both to get a comprehensive picture of where current and future barriers in your community may be. So hopefully that answers that question. They're technically two separate tools, but they're partners that we work with, both of those partners. So we kind of share both of those tools as needed with town. So maps and tools such as these are critical to understanding the natural landscape and identifying priority areas in your community. But I also want to emphasize today how these maps and tools can be used to bridge the gap from inventory to actual specific actions on the ground that you as a community or a climate action committee can think about taking. So common things that we recommend to increase resilience and increase community resilience as well as improve the habitat conditions are to revise ordinances to increase setbacks along shorelines, coastal wetlands, and floodplains to provide a natural buffer against flooding, erosion, and storm surge. And so here we're talking about things like resource protection to include more wetlands than may be captured by mandatory state shoreline zoning, as well as thinking about increasing the required buffer in areas to protect wetlands or waterways that are key to flood mitigation or that are vulnerable to storm surge. We already kind of spoke about identifying and addressing tidal restrictions and stream barriers, which can also help to mitigate flooding, increase infrastructure resiliency, and restore marsh hydrology for crossings that are tidal or are affecting those vulnerable coastal habitats. Stream Smart Crossing Techniques is a program that one of our partners, Maine Audubon, does a lot of trainings on and works with Maine DOT. So that's a set of kind of engineering guidelines that are going to improve the amount of water that can be passed, as well as improve the habitat conditions for aquatic species in the areas that a crossing is upgraded. And there's also kind of always a spectrum from policy and ordinance tools all the way to voluntary measures. So we can also help with things like education and outreach to landowners that are on sensitive shoreline areas or might be improving crossings on their own land. And so that's can be an effective tool for communities to take that voluntary route and just increase awareness of the importance of these type of habitats and the ecosystem functions that they're providing as a complement to potential municipal policies. This was one of my planned pauses, so I think I'm doing okay enough on time to take a pause here and see if anybody has a question that makes sense to answer now.
Just encourage folks to come off mute if you have a question. You want to just come right off of mute and ask the question would be fine.
I think we're supposed to wait about 15 seconds, right? Give people enough chance. So I have at least one more planned stop, so I'm going to keep going for now into building a little bit of a different story. So this is one of the great parts of my job is not just, you know, working with towns that want to take action to increase resilience and benefit their habitats, but to really kind of try and tell a story and just get folks interested in some of the why. Again, kind of beyond the maps and data. So I'm going to move on to an example from our map 2, which depicts high value plant and animal habitats. So these are things like protected species or habitat types that are defined and protected under the Natural Resources Protection Act in Maine. Those are significant wildlife habitats, as well as rare plants and exemplary natural communities. So we're sticking with the Pittsburgh example here. And I'm going to go to a different view of our online habitat viewer. And so here I have turned off the aquatic species and habitats, and I'm kind of mirroring the high value plants and animal habitats. So this one's looking pretty busy, but again, you can kind of explore this on your own and turn on and off anything you're interested in. Another thing I wanted to point out that's nice about this tool is that you can use it at different scales than our paper map. So if you're doing something like watershed level planning or working with a neighboring community, you can customize your view to look at that scale, or you can drill right down to specific neighborhood or community focus area. So in this map, I've got our rare plants and animals turned on, and we're going to move next into some interesting information about how important salt marshes are. So I'm just highlighting here a record for Salt Hay Salt Marsh. So, and to go back to Pete's question, that there's no SVPs mapped on this screenshot here, but this is the suite that they would show up under. So now I'll spend a bit of time talking about how special salt marshes are. They occur along the coast of Maine and are home to many unique and rare plants and animals. The salt marsh sparrow pictured here was recently listed as endangered under the Maine Endangered Species Act, and they're really kind of they are obligated to this kind of habitat. And one reason that they're vulnerable, as well as salt marshes in general, is just that it's a rare habitat within the state. It's ringed by a lot of development because of where our patterns of development are in Maine. And on top of that, it's now vulnerable to sea level rise. So as normal high tides or storm surges are getting higher and higher up into the marshes, and marshes are very low lying, the plants and animals that live in areas that are normally not submerged all the time, that kind of higher area or area that's dry part of the time is getting shrunk as sea level is encroaching. So these salt marsh sparrows make their nests in areas of the marsh that are normally just above the high tide mark. And so as we have more of these frequent storm surges and intense storms, they're having a lot of nest failure because they're just not able, the nest get washed out or get submerged. So there's still areas of the marsh where they're have healthy populations and are able to breed, but those are kind of eventually turning more into islands as the rest of the low-lying marsh gets drowned out. In addition to that one particular species, which is kind of a great icon for the marshes, there's a whole host. I should point out this is a photo of Scarborough Marsh, and this list is particular to Scarborough Marsh, but all of the salt marshes in the state have a variety of rare plants and animals that call them home. And they're also very important kind of nurseries for a lot of our shellfish and commercial fishery species. And so that's kind of from the biodiversity point of view. And they also provide really important ecosystem functions like filtering water, attenuating, storing a lot of flood water and helping that to absorb, and being a buffer from those intense storms between storm surge and the communities or any development behind it. So there's really a whole host of reasons that these habitats are very important to our biodiversity in the state, as well as our community co-benefits. And as I said, they've kind of historically been under development pressure or just getting fragmented due to development patterns, but they're now kind of doubly impacted by sea level rise and extreme precipitation, which is contributing to more high water levels. So I will go through this. Yeah, I like a good diagram. So for folks that want to think about it in this way, I'll talk a little bit about the dynamics in a salt marsh. So on the left-hand side here, we have kind of the water level and the normal fluctuation of the tides, which is routinely flooding the low part of the marsh. And there's certain kinds of vegetation and animals that kind of tolerate that or occupy that area of the marsh. Then there's, as you transition to upland of the marsh, there's a different vegetation community. This is where things like those nesting birds are going to be making their nests. And as those high tides and storm surge repeatedly encroach into this area of the marsh, it can cause a problem for, it basically displaces things that don't want to live in those submerged or salty conditions. There's a couple mechanisms that can help a marsh to be resilient, which include the sediment dynamics. If a marsh has kind of a healthy, natural connections to the waterways around them, there's going to be some natural sediment deposition into the marsh, and that can help it to keep up with pace with sea level rise. So as sediment gets deposited, it raises the level of the marsh, and that in some cases can be just enough. There's also the potential for these communities to gradually move upland as these conditions become not positive anymore. The plants and animal communities can migrate to the upland, and that becomes kind of a new zone of marsh. So it's good news that there's a couple mechanisms for marshes to stay healthy and persistent for the future. One thing that's important for communities to think about, and that I'll talk about with some tools in a couple slides, is where we've kind of presented barriers to marsh migration through things like seawalls or roads and human development. And so in areas where the marsh does not have undeveloped space behind it or connected to it, as it gets drowned out, it doesn't really have anywhere to go. And that's where these marsh systems can really be impacted and lost eventually. And a good reason to plan ahead for, again, both that biodiversity component as well as those important resilience and co-benefits that marshes provide to our communities. So now we'll kind of toggle back to some tool talk using tools from a couple of our partners that we work with. This is a screenshot of the Maine Natural Areas Program Potential Marsh Migration Map tool. And I have links at the bottom of all these slides to the tools. And so this is the ecologists at Maine Natural Areas Program have mapped all of the current salt marsh locations in the state. And then you can get to your area of interest, very similar to the other tools that we talked about. And you can toggle through different modeled sea level rise scenarios. And so what this is showing you is here's in dark green, the current extent of salt marsh. And as you go through sea level rise scenarios, these lighter colors that pop up are areas that will provide suitable future conditions for the marsh to move into. And so as you're thinking about your climate planning and your community resilience and conservation of these vulnerable habitats, undeveloped areas in these future suitable sites are going to be key for conservation actions like increased buffers or conservation acquisitions, so that the marsh community and all those ecosystem functions that it's providing can have that space to kind of breathe and move into and persist into the future. These next couple of screenshots are from Maine Geological Survey's sea level rise and storm surge mapper. And we also have an expert on the call with Pete if anybody has questions that I can't answer about this, but this is another, again, really similarly styled tool that models current highest astronomical tide and a host of sea level rise scenarios. So this is not tied to a specific habitat type, but where I just kind of talked about salt marshes for a while and the importance of those. Pete's going to talk about sand dunes and the importance of those systems. And so this sea level rise and storm surge mapper can help you to study where sea level rise is going to be impacting your community across all areas, not just the salt marsh area. So these are kind of two tools that you can use to think about planning for sea level rise.
Hey, Corinne, you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. So I'll wrap up the salt marsh talk with this kind of takeaway slide. We're looking at the tools and the maps and thinking about what actions you can take on the ground in your community to increase the resilience and the persistence of those habitats. And just about done here. So I just wanted to broaden up a little bit more, and I'll talk more about focus areas in our kind of partner talk in a couple of weeks. But beginning with habitat also has statewide focus areas of ecological significance. And those are unique areas across the state where conservation actions can really benefit the biodiversity and the resilience of those areas into the future. And again, some broad takeaways of how conservation actions can be taken in those areas to benefit your community and the state as a whole. So that's it. I did make it to the end. Probably don't have too much extra time for questions, but I'm also happy to get back in touch with folks later. I can go through the chat or things like that. This handy little QR code will take you right to our website, and feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Corinne, we did have one question. Maybe I'll see if you can get to this one, and if not, we can, like you said, provide an answer. But this is from Tom. How are the limits of the various habitats, wetlands, etc., determined by field methods or aerial photography?
Yep, that's a great question. I'll give kind of a broad and quick answer to say that not all data sets are done the same way. Wetlands are mapped using the National Wetlands Inventory. We use USGS hydrography data set. And then things that are more species and habitat specific, MNAP professionals and MDI-FW professionals are kind of constantly rotating through target species and habitats and updating those layers with on-the-ground methods in the state. Now I have to figure out how to.
Thank you. Yes, as our next presenter sets up his slides, I want to thank Corinne for a really informative presentation. We'll make that presentation available in an email that we send out later in the week. And hopefully you've all jotted down her information if you have more questions and want to reach out directly on behalf of your community. So we'll let Pete get set up, and he probably needs no introduction, but we'll reintroduce him. He's marine geologist with Maine Geological Survey. And today Pete's going to be talking about how climate change is impacting vulnerable dune habitat. So it looks like you are all set up, Pete, and take it away. And please hold your questions or put them in the chat, and we'll cover those when he's finished with his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. I hope everybody can hear me well. Thanks, Corinne, for that great overview of the tools that BWH provides for communities. I'm going to shift straight to the coast here, and we're going to talk a bit about coastal sand dunes and some best management practices that not only homeowners but communities can take as it relates to managing their dunes. So is there a way for me to get rid of it? Can you guys see this, my share tab up at the top? No? Okay.
We don't.
All right, great. So coastal sand dunes really are one of the key buffers along our shorelines for not only developed areas, but also undeveloped areas. They also protect marsh habitats, something that Corinne brought up, from storms, and provide vital habitat for a range of species. It's really important for people to understand that dunes are extremely dynamic features. They have been changing over millennia, and have been in response to sea level rise and storms, have actually been migrating landward for millennia. And that has not been a problem until humanity has started to put things in its way. And we'll talk about why that's an issue. So this is what I call the tank tread concept, which describes how beaches and dunes migrate in a landward direction in response to storms and sea level rise. So at time one, you've got a marsh system on the backside of your dune. There's a dune over here. There's a beach, and mean sea level is kind of over here. And with time, as sea level rises, you can see this is just a cartoon, but there's accommodation space for this system to move landward or transgress in response to sea level rise. So at time two, what it does is it's the same thing. It just moves up the landscape, okay? This is assuming that there's room for this system to move. Now, in the short term, sand dunes and beaches are constantly exchanging sand, and sand is constantly moving around through the process of erosion, scarping, dune overwash, and bar formation. So this is a little bit complex, but if you look at the dashed black line, that represents kind of your beach profile during the summer. So we have a nice rich area, sand-rich area called the berm, where people recreate. Birds also nest in that area. And in the winter, that becomes more of a concave shape. You get erosion of that berm, and sand is deposited in the offshore in a bar. Now, storms will come along usually in the winter, and they'll actually chew out the dune more and cause what we call dune scarping, which is a vertical cut in the dune. At the same time, some of those dunes get overtopped through the process of dune overwash, and sometimes, if we're lucky enough, old marsh surfaces get exposed in the surf zone. So why would we find an old marsh surface in the surf zone? Well, that goes back to this tank tread concept, such that at time 2, you've got your beach and your dune, and the old marsh is in the surf zone, okay? So that's what we see during storms, and that's what we've seen this winter. So this is just an example of dune overwash from Ferry Beach State Park. This is extensive overwash, about 150 feet wide. You can see how the sand just got deposited on the backside. This is the dune trying to maintain its elevation and move landward in response to storms. At the same time, this is a vertical cut in the scarp. This is about a really good sized scarp at Pine Point Beach, about 6 to 8 feet in height. And you can tell the sand was removed from the scarp and pulled offshore. And this actually is just from this past winter. This is a shot from Fortunes Rocks Beach. This is an old marsh surface. There's actually still marsh grass on this. It's covered by a thin veneer of sand usually, but this winter tore all that sand off and pulled it all offshore. Now erosion is actually, it's eroding this old marsh surface. So again, the beach used to be hundreds of feet seaward, and the marsh used to be back here. Now this is what we're seeing today. However, dunes are also really, really important in the day-to-day or seasonal exchanges of sand in what we call a summer versus winter beach shape. And I talked about that a tiny bit, but just reiterating, the dune is kind of the reservoir for the sand for the rest of the beach. And then that sand gets exchanged over time. So in a summer beach, you've got, again, this convex beach shape where you've got a rich sandy berm where we put our blankets and play ball and stuff like that. That then kind of, the beach kind of goes out into the intertidal zone. During that winter beach, that berm is eroded, and then that sand is moved offshore. That sand also can be eroded from the dune and also moved offshore. So there's this constant transfer of sand. So kind of think of it like a checking account and a savings account, and you're constantly transferring money between the two. So this is what that actually looks like. And this is, I can't believe this image is that old, but this is what in Bayview area of Saco, this is a summer beach profile. You can see all the sand up there. The dune grass is green, and there's a nice rich sandy berm, and then it kind of slopes off into the offshore. And this is a winter profile. You can see how flat it is and how the dune has been scarped, and you can't really see the bars out here, but there is more sediment out here, you can tell from the summer photo. So I'm going to now switch into some of the regulatory stuff as it relates to sand dune systems. Sand dunes are actually protected under the Natural Resources Protection Act in Chapter 355. This has a specific definition of a sand dune system. I'm not going to read that. Everybody can read for themselves. But one of the key things I think people need to understand is the dune can extend from almost into a wetland all the way down to mean low water. Okay, so it's all one linked system. That whole thing is a sand dune system. All right, that's part of the regulated sand dune system. So you can have portions of dunes that are in marshes, and then the dune actually extends down to mean low water. This is a schematic of how we regulate sand dunes. And one thing that I'll add in here a little after I describe this is the erosion hazard area, or EHA. So your beach and berm is out in the front down to about mean low water. The frontal dune is that first part of the dune that is adjacent to the water. It's the most dynamic part. It's changing almost on a daily basis. The back dunes are areas that extend behind that frontal dune ridge and go much farther inland, sometimes extending all the way to the marsh. They're much more stable in general. However, there are portions of our dunes that we consider erosion hazard areas. All frontal dunes are considered an erosion hazard area because of how dynamic they are. Portions of back dunes could be erosion hazard areas. And the erosion hazard area has a really long definition that I'm not going to really get into, but the idea is that where might the shoreline be, or where might coastal flooding impact over the next 100 years after 2 feet of sea level rise, okay? Our coastal sand dune rules need to catch up with where we're going at the state level with sea level scenarios, which is 4 feet of sea level rise, all right? So we're already talking about twice that. So our EHA mapping is already a little old. So what that might look like, well, we've actually released a map series online. We used to only map to about 2,000 acres of sand dunes in Maine, and most of them were in York and Cumberland counties, excluding Casco Bay also. Now, we have mapped the rest of the coast, approximately about 1,500 additional acres, including Casco Bay and all the way down east to Washington County. So we have this map series that you can go and look, and this is what the landing page would look like. And there's these blocks, and each of these blocks shows where a dune system is. If you would click on one of those blocks, you can download a PDF, or you can zoom in our viewer and type in an address or something. But now I'm looking at a dune system. I think this is called Andrews Beach. It's on Long Island in Casco Bay. And you can see how we've mapped area of frontal dune, back dune in yellow, and the EHA in this kind of hatched area. So this is one thing looking at it like this, but what does it actually look like in real life? Well, we just shot these last week, doing some work out in Casco Bay with some drones. And this is a shot of that same beach system from an oblique angle. And you can see the frontal dune area, and this isn't perfect, I just cartooned this. The back dune area that extends into a coastal wetland, there's a coastal wetland over here, and then the erosion hazard area, okay? So I want to finish talking a little bit about how communities and property owners can best manage their dunes. And then we have 2 documents that we've released over the years. One is the Beach and Dune Best Management Practices document, which is constantly evolving. And then our Maine Coastal Property Owners Guide. So the 2 kind of supplement each other. So I'm going to focus on our Best Management Practices Guide and walk you through each of these things. The first is, what do I do in my dune if we get lots of stuff washed into there? Well, as I showed you, overwash is a natural process, and a lot of wood gets washed into the dunes. If it's natural wood, leave it. If it's sand, leave it. If it's non-natural lumber, like this, this pressure-treated wood over here, maybe a piece of a dock over here, that can be pulled out without a permit. That's not a big deal. We also get, through overwash, sand going into roads because we've built roads along the beaches. Natural sand that washes into dune systems should just be left. When it's washed into developed areas like roads, you can see what's happening with this tractor. They're kind of shoveling it all into an area, and then they're going to be pushing that back out onto the beach, okay? And sand should be pushed back out on the beach to try to conserve the sand that's on the beach in situations like this. Seaweed management is another big one. Seaweed that's washed up on the beach really provides vital nutrients to dune grass. So what we recommend is taking that dune grass and kind of spreading it at the toe of an eroded scarp, just like in this image on the down on the right hand side. And in some areas, that can be done without a permit if you're doing it by hand. In some communities, they actually use mechanized equipment to do that. That requires a permit. That stuff can be spread back again against the dune over here. And then there's this Japanese red that I can't even pronounce it, but it's an invasive seaweed that should actually be removed if possible during these processes. All right, what do I do to protect my dune? Well, the best thing is to simply put out a fence to keep people out, and put it out about 10 to 15 feet from the edge of your dune so that dune grass can heal. So you can see this dune was scarped. This is from Crescent Beach State Park, but it's actually collapsed in some areas, and the dune grass is starting to grow out. So as this scarp becomes unstable, it collapses, and then the dune grass will regrow in those areas that it collapses. These simple stake and twine fencing is meant to allow that to just grow seaward. You can do that without a permit. More enhanced fencing, which is really designed to trap sand, can be used, but that probably would require a permit from DEP. And these are a couple examples. This is just snow fencing that's put out. It's a plastic fencing actually that's used. This was tested by a consultant in Algonquin. 3 different kinds of techniques. This kind of fencing versus zigzag fencing versus simply putting lath in the sand that the wind then blows against these, and if you stagger these properly, you're going to catch a lot of sand. The upper 2 require permits. The lower one doesn't require a permit. In
You've
some
got about 2
areas,
more minutes.
thank you. In some areas that are very developed, we have a lot of cobble. This is from down in Drake's Island Beach. This beach in the winter becomes cobble dominated, and during storms, this cobble is launched towards these houses. So cobble fencing is allowed in some of these areas. They're open fences, you can kind of see, that are literally meant to just trap the cobble in front of them. And then that cobble is returned to the beach. They do require a permit from Maine DEP. Dune paths, this is one of my favorite topics. The traditional way of doing a dune path is on the left-hand side of this figure. That is, every single house has its own dune path that goes directly to the house. That is the worst thing that you can do in a dune system. These, as many people learned, act like floodways and runways for floodwater and erosion during our big storms. So this path would have gotten carved all the way out, and floodwater would have gone and hit this house. And that's what we saw a lot of during these storms in January. One way to approach this is to place the path in between homes instead and share a path, and then actually zigzag it through the dune, okay? This still requires a cut through the dune. The most protective dune is a contiguous dune that isn't broken by a path. So in that option, you can actually run a mat up and over the dune that allows for the dune path to go up and over the dune instead of through it. Another option is walkovers. These have to be put strategically in locations and spaced properly to allow dune grass to grow. And you can see it's a contiguous dune underneath this. My last couple slides. Dune restoration is something that can be done with a very simple permit from Maine DEP. And we recommend that these dunes be built 1 foot above the FEMA 100-year base flood elevation. Now there's something that's called enhanced dune restoration that is now permissible under a special permit by rule through Chapter 305 that uses coir materials to kind of form a core, or in some areas you could use cobble to form that core. And then sand is brought in and covers that, and dune grass planted. If metal anchors are used, like as is shown here, that would require a more in-depth kind of permitting. A couple things we've been testing up at Popham Beach is the use of driftwood. So you can see on the left-hand side, what we did is we took driftwood that had washed up on the beach and we staggered it in rows, and that caught sand. And then over time, the dune grass grew into those areas, rebuilding the dune. Unfortunately, that all got wiped out during the winters of the storm of in the winter this year. So what we're trying now is to actually use Christmas trees. The park collected Christmas trees, and we went out and built these trees into rows. And just in a couple of weeks, they've trapped a lot of sand. And now this front row is actually fully covered as of right now. Beach scraping is something that can be done with a permit. This basically is taking sand and pushing it up the beach and kind of mimicking that sand coming back up the profile during the summer. It's then planted with dune grass and stabilized. And then the last thing and this requires extensive permitting typically, is beach nourishment. This is done at Scarborough Beach, Western Beach in Scarborough. This is like over 100,000 cubic yards that's dredged from the channel. This is a federal project, but smaller projects, less than 10,000 cubic yards now, are allowed to be done under a permit by rule for Maine DEP, because we're realizing that dune restoration and beach nourishment are things that kind of need to be allowed to help maintain the dune systems. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pete. That was great. I really appreciated it. I think everyone did, especially like the illustrative stories and the locations that we recognize. Thank you so much. Questions for Pete? Either typing in the chat or simply come off of mute and ask your question. We have some time.
have a quick
Hi, this is, oh, sorry.
Hi, Sarah.
Just a quick question. Pete, do you see that beach nourishment type of thing happening on a smaller scale, or have you yet, or do you know communities that are planning it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have seen a smaller nourishment project permitted down in Wells, and that was done in conjunction with the federal dredge that was done. So the federal dredge was done, and a lot of sand, over 100,000 cubic yards, was put along Drake's Island Beach. And then a permit by rule was used to put less than 10,000 cubic yards into a pocket at the end of where Drake's Island Beach and Loudholme Beach meet, into that pocket. So that's the only one I can think of right now that's been permitted. But the whole idea of allowing this permit by rule is so that you don't have to go through extensive permitting to bring in external sand to do smaller beach nourishment projects that might be, several homes or, 5 or 10 homes, something like that.
Yeah, but it's usually done in concert with dredging because they need a source for the sand. But
Yes.
what if you're just sort of redistributing sand that's been moved along or like outside of a beach area? Is that
External source?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the whole idea of the permit by rule, to allow sand that's beach compatible to be brought in from, a gravel pit or something like that to
Okay.
build beaches and rebuild the dunes. Beach scraping, that other example I already provided, is something that can be, just done with a permit by rule also. So somebody's asking, what do I mean by a permit by rule? So that's a whole chapter in the Natural Resources Protection Act, Chapter 305 it's called, and there are permit by rules for a number of activities. And what it is it's not considered a de minimis activity, but it is a expedited DEP application process where minimal permit materials are provided because the impacts from those activities are considered to be not major. So there's much less review required, and it's about a 14-day turnaround period from DEP on those activities.
Hey, Pete, I had a quick question. This is Fred from South Portland. You mentioned that the erosion hazard area maybe is a little outdated. Do you have any thoughts about the extent to which we may be underestimating the rate of sea level rise?
I'm not thinking we're underestimating the rate of sea level rise right now. I think the old sand dune rules that refer to the EHA do. They talk about 2 feet of sea level rise over the next 100 years. So that doesn't even say 2 feet by 2100. That says 2 feet over the next 100 years from the date an application is submitted. That, I think, is grossly low. The Maine Won't Wait process has adopted 1.5 feet by 2050 and 4 feet, so doubling that by the year 2100. And then there's, consideration for plan to prepare numbers, which are higher than that. So our current EHA, yes, is the way it's defined is grossly probably inadequate.
Other questions?
Comment for Pete. We must go to the same barber.
Thanks, Tom.
I'm guessing,
Other questions or comments?
I'm guessing that's a DIY barber, right? So I imagine you, unless, you must do it yourselves perhaps, or do you actually go to a barber? Is there a need for such a thing with that particular style, I wonder?
How about you, Fred? No.
I'm totally, actually.
It's a W job for me.
Me too. Do it yourself.
DIY job, sorry.
If
I
there
guess
are any additional questions for Corinne as well, now would be a great time to ask those too.
This is sort of for Corinne, and the reason I asked the question about how the boundaries were determined. Over the extent of my career, I find that various boards, and often planning boards, misuse the information. It's a great planning tool, don't get me wrong. I mean, it gives you an area to focus in on, but without on the ground truthing of wetland boundaries or other things, really doesn't help the process much. It just gives a false sense to the planning people and the anti-people grab hold of it and shake it up in the air and say, look, it's all wetlands or it's all bad soils. Well, that may not be the case until you ground proof it. So that was the reason I asked. I mean, certainly a very valuable tool that we use in Biddeford quite a bit to just pre-screen applications and get a good idea of what is potentially out there. But there's nothing like real field truthing, and I guess that makes the nerd in me come out. So
Yeah, I guess I'll just make a quick observation based on that. Those are really good points. Our maps are for planning purposes only, and as we always kind of like to point out, you know, the plants and animals are not sticking to a town boundary or a specific boundary on the map, so that ground truthing for an actual development level project or crafting a specific ordinance is definitely important. And one more quick point I'll make is just to say that we suggest that folks reach out to Beginning with Habitat about every year, or if it's been more than a year since you've had a data set or map, feel free to reach out, and that way we'll make sure that the planning board or whatever they're being used for is using that most up-to-date data.
I have a quick follow-up question to that, Corinne, about the GIS data on the Beginning with Habitat map, and particularly the impervious cover data. I mean, do you know how current that is, or is that fairly dated?
I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on that. It's not updated as frequently as some of our other data sets, but I believe that based on a more, so the current depiction may be a bit outdated, meaning like within the last 10 years, but we're actually working on updating some of our data sets based on like LiDAR and some newer data sets that have come out. So again, reach out anytime and we'll be happy to share the latest and greatest.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Pete. And thank you all for joining us. We will be following up with you later this week with the recording, the slide deck, and contact information so you can send any follow-up questions that you have. We put in the chat the registration for the presentation that will be on May 8th, focused on inland habitat, and we encourage you all to join us then. Thank you so much for being here with us and learning with us.